The war was over, but surrender brought no peace. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across Germany's shattered landscape, thousands of German women found themselves behind barbed wire, stripped of everything except the uniforms they wore and the dignity they fought to preserve. These were not civilians caught in crossfire. They were Helferinnen, female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, trained signals operators, anti-aircraft gunners, and administrative staff who had served the Third Reich with discipline and conviction. Now they stood in muddy compounds across occupied Germany, facing guards who spoke languages they barely understood, uncertain whether they would be treated as soldiers, criminals, or something worse. What happened next would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about war, justice, and humanity itself. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe so you never miss our next story. The German military mobilized over 500,000 women during World War II, a fact that remains obscure in popular memory. Unlike Soviet or British women who served in combat roles openly celebrated after victory, German women auxiliaries occupied a gray zone in post-war consciousness. They had not carried rifles into battle, yet they had enabled the Nazi war machine through technical expertise and logistical support. The Luftwaffenhelferinnen operated searchlights and ranging equipment for anti-aircraft batteries. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen managed communications networks that coordinated military operations across Europe. Stabshelferinnen served as administrative personnel in Wehrmacht headquarters from Berlin to occupied territories. These women wore uniforms, followed military discipline, and understood themselves as soldiers serving their nation. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, they expected to be treated according to the laws of war. What they encountered instead was confusion, inconsistency, and a moral reckoning nobody had prepared them for. The surrender document signed at Rams on May 7th and ratified in Berlin on May 8th addressed military forces without clear distinction by gender. German armed forces capitulated unconditionally, but the status of women auxiliaries remained ambiguous under international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 defined prisoners of war as members of armed forces, but most signatory nations had not contemplated women in quasi-military roles when drafting these provisions. Were German women auxiliaries combatants entitled to POW status, or civilians who could be detained as security risks? Different Allied commands answered this question differently. American forces generally classified women auxiliaries as disarmed enemy personnel, requiring screening rather than long-term internment. British commands varied by theater and local commander discretion. Soviet forces made no distinction, treating women auxiliaries as war criminals subject to deportation and forced labor. This legal uncertainty created conditions where individual commanders exercised enormous power over thousands of women whose fate hung on administrative decisions made in chaos. The first mass surrenders of women auxiliaries occurred in northern Germany during the final weeks of April 1945. British Second Army advanced through Lower Saxony, encountering Wehrmacht units that included female signals and administrative personnel. Near Celle, approximately 200 Nachrichtenhelferinnen surrendered with their male counterparts from a communications regiment on April 14th. They arrived at improvised holding areas expecting temporary detention before release, carrying small bags with personal items and wearing the field gray uniforms that marked their service. British guards, many of whom had never encountered uniformed German women, reacted with confusion and discomfort. Standing orders required disarmament and searching of all prisoners, but no protocols existed for searching women. Some units improvised segregated areas and requested female personnel from nursing or administrative services to conduct searches. Others simply waved women through checkpoints without inspection, unwilling to address the logistical and cultural complications. This inconsistency would create both protection and vulnerability for women prisoners, depending entirely on the character of individual commanders. The largest concentration of women POWs gathered at camps established in Schleswig-Holstein after the German surrender. Between May 10th and May 20th, 1945, approximately 18,000 women auxiliaries passed through British processing centers near Flensburg and Neuengamme. They came from across northern Germany, surrendering units from the Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, and Wehrmacht administrative services. The British command established separate compounds for women, surrounding them with barbed wire and guard posts identical to those for male prisoners. Inside these enclosures, women slept on bare ground under canvas tarps, received minimal rations, and waited for interrogation that would determine their future. The shock of captivity hit hardest for those who had served in comfortable administrative posts behind the lines. Stabshelferinnen, who had worked in warm offices, typing orders, and filing reports, now squatted in mud, sharing single latrines with hundreds of others, their carefully maintained uniforms degrading into rags within days. Among these prisoners was Margarete Schroeder, a 24-year-old signals operator from Hamburg who had joined the Nachrichtenhelferin Corps in 1942. Her personnel file, preserved in British archives, records her capture near Kiel on May 6 with her communications unit. Margarete had operated radio equipment coordinating Luftwaffe fighter defenses over northern Germany, work that required technical training and security clearance. She had believed in her duty, convinced that defending German airspace protected civilians from Allied bombing, even as Hamburg burned around her family's apartment. When British forces occupied her position, she surrendered her equipment and expected professional treatment as a military prisoner. Instead, she found herself herded into a field with 2,000 other women, surrounded by guards who looked at them with expressions she could not read, contempt mixed with something closer to pity. The uncertainty terrified her more than combat ever had. The question of searching women prisoners forced Allied commanders to confront assumptions about gender, security, and human dignity. Standard POW processing required thorough searches to confiscate weapons, intelligence documents, and valuables. For male prisoners, this meant emptying pockets, removing boots, and sometimes strip searches if intelligence value warranted. Applying identical procedures to women created profound discomfort among Allied personnel, raised in cultures that considered such intimate contact with women beyond propriety except under medical necessity. Yet security concerns were legitimate. Intelligence reports documented cases where German personnel attempted to destroy or conceal classified materials during surrender. Some Allied commanders insisted women prisoners posed equal security risks and required equivalent searching. Others considered forcible searching of women morally unacceptable, regardless of military necessity. This tension produced confrontations that revealed deep cultural conflicts about power, vulnerability, and respect. At a British processing center near Lübeck in mid-May 1945, guards attempted to search a group of approximately 100 Luftwaffenhelferinnen who had operated anti-aircraft positions. The women had been told to prepare for inspection and assumed this meant a verbal interview. When British military police indicated they would conduct physical searches, the women refused. Their spokesman, a 32-year-old Oberhelferin named Erika Hartmann, informed guards through an interpreter that they would submit to questioning, fingerprinting, and photographing, but would not undress or submit to touching by male personnel. The British sergeant in charge insisted that security protocols required searching. Erika responded that they were soldiers who had surrendered honorably and deserved treatment consistent with military convention. If physical searching was necessary, it must be conducted by women. The standoff lasted 3 hours with guards threatening consequences and prisoners standing firm, some weeping but none breaking ranks. The British command faced a dilemma with no clear solution. Forcing the searches would require physical coercion against resisting women, creating a spectacle that troubled even hardened soldiers. Capitulating to prisoner demands might encourage resistance and undermine authority across other camps. The local commander, a major whose name appears in reports only as J. Patterson, made a decision that reflected both pragmatism and residual chivalric instincts. He postponed searches pending availability of female personnel from the Army Territorial Service to conduct inspections. This compromise took 4 days to implement, during which the women remained in a separate compound under guard but unmolested. When ATS personnel finally arrived and conducted searches, they found no weapons or intelligence materials of significance, only personal letters, photographs, and small items of sentimental value the women had carried through Germany's collapse. This incident at Lübeck spread through POW camps by the mysterious communication networks that operate in all prisoner populations. Within weeks, women in other compounds learned that organized resistance could compel different treatment. At a camp near Bremen, 300 women auxiliaries collectively refused searches unless conducted by women, citing the Lübeck precedent. At Neuengamme, women prisoners submitted written protests in formal military language, demanding treatment consistent with their status as uniformed personnel. These actions placed Allied commanders in increasingly uncomfortable positions. The war in Europe had ended, public attention was shifting to victory celebrations and reconstruction, and nobody wanted international publicity about forcing German women to strip at gunpoint. Yet maintaining security and authority in camps housing thousands of potentially hostile prisoners remained essential. The resolution came not through policy directives from higher command, but through improvised accommodations by field officers trying to maintain order without creating moral disasters. The deeper truth behind these confrontations involved something more complex than simple modesty or security concerns. For German women who had served in military auxiliaries, their uniforms represented the last remnant of identity and purpose in a world that had disintegrated around them. Many had joined the Helferinnen Corps, seeking meaningful contribution to what they believed was national survival. They had endured hardships, mastered technical skills, and earned respect within military structures. The prospect of forced undressing before enemy soldiers represented not merely physical violation, but complete erasure of their self-conception as disciplined professionals. When they refused, they were defending not their bodies alone, but their conviction that they had served honorably in roles that deserved recognition, even in defeat. This insistence on dignity, despite powerlessness, would prove more effective than any weapon they might have concealed. The American approach to women POWs differed significantly from British practices, reflecting both different legal interpretations and cultural attitudes. American forces classified most women auxiliaries as civilians, requiring screening rather than long-term internment. Women, captured in American zones, typically underwent interrogation at temporary facilities before release to civilian status. This process often took only days or weeks rather than months. An American intelligence report from June 1945 describes processing approximately 500 women auxiliaries captured in Bavaria, noting that interrogators found them forthcoming about their duties and generally apolitical in motivation. The report concludes that these women posed no security threat and recommended immediate release after basic documentation. This pragmatic approach avoided the prolonged confrontations that characterized British camps. But it also reflected a tendency to dismiss women as insignificant to military analysis, a form of gender bias that ironically worked in prisoners' favor. Yet not all American encounters with women prisoners proceeded smoothly. At a facility near Mannheim, American guards discovered a group of women auxiliaries had concealed documents related to Wehrmacht communications procedures. The women had sewn papers into uniform linings, attempting to preserve technical information they believed might have intelligence value for bargaining. When confronted, they initially denied possession, then argued the materials were personal property. The American intelligence officer who debriefed them, Captain Robert Morrison from Ohio, found himself in an extended negotiation that felt more like a labor dispute than military interrogation. The women wanted assurances about their treatment and future status before surrendering documents. Morrison, constrained by regulations requiring document seizure, but also instructed to avoid incidents, eventually agreed to provide written receipts and statements that cooperation would be noted in their files. The women handed over the materials, which proved of minimal intelligence value, the German communications networks they documented having already been thoroughly compromised. These interactions revealed fundamental tensions in how military structures process gender in extreme circumstances. The Allied forces of 1945 were overwhelmingly male institutions with deeply ingrained assumptions about women as civilians requiring protection or, in adversarial contexts, as suspects requiring different handling than male enemies. German women who insisted on recognition as military personnel challenged these frameworks by demanding treatment that acknowledged their service while simultaneously invoking protections based on gender. They wanted to be seen as soldiers when it served their dignity, and as women when it served their safety. This strategic flexibility infuriated some Allied personnel who saw it as manipulative, while others recognized it as rational adaptation to impossible circumstances. The moral complexity troubled thoughtful observers who understood that conventional categories were inadequate for situations the architects of international law had not imagined. The physical conditions in women's POW camps varied enormously depending on location, timing, and local resources. The best facilities were converted German military installations with intact barracks, sanitation, and kitchens. The worst were muddy fields enclosed by barbed wire where women slept under inadequate tenting through cold spring rains. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions where hundreds shared minimal toilet facilities and washing water. British medical reports from June 1945 document outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections in women's compounds. Treatment capacity was limited, medical supplies scarce, and priority went to Allied personnel and civilian populations freed from concentration camps. German POWs, regardless of gender, ranked low in the hierarchy of medical concern. Women suffered additionally from lack of sanitary supplies for menstruation, a problem military logistics had not anticipated and could not easily address. Some camps improvised solutions with rags and limited washing facilities. Others simply ignored the problem, leaving women to manage as best they could with no resources. Nutrition posed another severe challenge. Rations for German POWs in the immediate post-war months averaged between 800 and 1,200 calories daily, far below sustenance levels. This shortage reflected both limited food supplies in devastated Germany and deliberate policy decisions that German prisoners should not consume resources needed for Allied forces in liberated populations. Women generally received the same rations as men, an equality that disadvantaged smaller individuals who could not supplement meager distributions. The diet consisted primarily of bread, thin soup, and occasional potatoes. Protein was nearly absent, vegetables rare, milk non-existent. Women lost weight rapidly, their already worn uniforms hanging loose on shrinking frames. Photographs from this period, preserved in archives, show faces marked by hunger and exhaustion, eyes reflecting trauma and uncertainty. These images disturb modern viewers precisely because they depict suffering imposed not by battlefield necessity, but by administrative indifference during peace. Yet amid this hardship, women prisoners demonstrated remarkable resilience and self-organization. In larger camps, they established internal governance structures, appointed representatives to negotiate with camp authorities, and created systems for sharing resources and maintaining morale. At a British camp near Hamburg housing approximately 3,000 women auxiliaries, prisoners organized themselves by former units, electing spokespersons and maintaining military discipline among themselves. They conducted informal classes teaching languages, technical skills, and cultural subjects. They formed choirs that sang German folk songs and hymns, performances that both sustained their spirits and unsettled guards who heard harmonized voices rising from behind barbed wire. These activities represented more than distraction from misery. They were assertions of continued identity and community, refusals to be reduced to mere victims awaiting disposition by authorities indifferent to their humanity. The interrogation process for women POWs focused primarily on intelligence, gathering about German military operations, and identifying individuals who might have committed war crimes. Allied intelligence services wanted information about Wehrmacht, command structures, communication systems, and any knowledge prisoners might have about Nazi Party activities. For most women auxiliaries, interrogations were brief and perfunctory. They had performed technical or administrative functions without access to strategic information or involvement in atrocities. Interrogators quickly determined they had nothing of value to offer and moved on to more promising subjects. However, women who had served in occupied territories or in proximity to SS units faced more intensive questioning. Interrogators sought evidence about crimes against civilians, treatment of forced laborers, and knowledge of concentration camps. These sessions could be terrifying, conducted in languages women barely understood, with translators who might distort questions or answers, and with interrogators whose demeanor ranged from professional courtesy to barely restrained hostility. One documented case involved Anna Becker, a Stabshelferin who had worked in Wehrmacht administration in occupied Poland from 1942 to 1944. British intelligence officers questioned her extensively about what she had witnessed regarding treatment of Polish civilians in Jewish populations. Anna maintained she had performed clerical duties, typing reports and maintaining files, without involvement in or detailed knowledge of security operations. Her interrogators pressed her on what she must have seen, what documents passed through her office, what conversations she overheard. Anna's responses, recorded in interrogation transcripts, reflect the terrible position of low-level personnel who participated in bureaucratic functions, supporting criminal enterprises without directly committing atrocities themselves. She admitted typing reports that mentioned security actions, using euphemisms she had not questioned at the time. She acknowledged awareness that Jewish populations were being relocated, though she claimed ignorance of extermination programs. Whether these claims represented truth, selective memory, or self-protective denial remains impossible to determine from transcripts alone. What emerges clearly is her growing horror as interrogators connected dots between her administrative work and crimes she had not allowed herself to comprehend. The moral reckoning forced on women prisoners by interrogation and by gradually emerging evidence of Nazi crimes created profound psychological crises. Many had believed they were serving legitimate national defense. The regime's propaganda had convinced them that Germany fought for survival against enemies determined to destroy their nation and culture. Discovering that their service had supported systematic mass murder shattered these narratives completely. Some prisoners rejected the evidence, insisting Allied accounts were exaggerated propaganda. Others fell into despair, unable to reconcile their self-conception as decent people with complicity in atrocity. A few found ways to separate their limited knowledge and influence from the regime's crimes, maintaining that they had done their duty according to their understanding at the time. These psychological struggles played out in camp populations through arguments, breakdowns, and occasional suicides. Allied authorities noted increasing depression and mental health crises among women prisoners as they confronted what their service had enabled. Release from POW status came gradually and unevenly across 1945 and into 1946. American forces released most women auxiliaries by autumn 1945, having determined they posed no security threat and represented no value for intelligence or war crimes prosecution. British authorities moved more slowly, maintaining camps into 1946 while conducting thorough screening and awaiting policy guidance from London. Soviet forces in the eastern zones treated women auxiliaries most harshly, deporting many to labor camps in the Soviet Union, where they joined millions of other prisoners working under conditions of extreme hardship. Western prisoners eventually released found themselves entering a Germany transformed almost beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, millions of refugees competed for scarce housing and food, and society was fragmenting into occupation zones with increasingly rigid boundaries. Women who had surrendered, believing they would return to familiar lives, discovered those lives had ceased to exist. The return to civilian life proved extraordinarily difficult. Women who had served in military auxiliaries faced suspicion and discrimination in post-war German society. They were associated with the Nazi regime and military defeat, reminders of a past most Germans wanted to forget. Employment was scarce, and employers hesitated to hire women with military records. Many concealed their service, burning uniforms and documents, constructing new identities as civilians who had worked in factories or offices. Others found themselves unable to speak about their experiences, the trauma of captivity compounding the moral crisis of confronting what they had supported. In the immediate post-war years, German society had little capacity for processing these complex experiences. Survival took priority over reflection, and former Helferinnen learned to keep silent about service they had once considered honorable. Yet the experience of captivity, particularly the confrontations over dignity and treatment, left lasting impressions on both prisoners and captors. Allied soldiers who guarded women POWs faced unsettling questions about what victory meant when it required incarcerating exhausted, hungry women behind barbed wire. Some guards treated prisoners with deliberate cruelty, seeing them as complicit in Nazi crimes deserving no sympathy. Others found themselves troubled by parallels between prisoners' conditions and concentration camp images that had shocked the world. This discomfort sometimes manifested in small acts of mercy, extra rations smuggled to pregnant women, medical attention provided despite regulations, warnings about camp conditions or upcoming transfers that allowed prisoners to prepare. These gestures remained unofficial and sporadic, dependent on individual conscience rather than policy. But they mattered enormously to recipients for whom any acknowledgement of shared humanity provided psychological sustenance more valuable than material aid. One British soldier, Corporal Thomas Whitaker from Manchester, kept a diary during his service guarding a women's POW camp near Celle from May to August 1945. His entries, donated to an archive by his family decades later, reveal the evolution of his thinking about prisoners and enemies. Early entries describe German women with hostility, calling them Nazis and expressing satisfaction at their discomfort. Gradually, his tone shifts as daily proximity humanized abstraction. He writes about a prisoner who reminded him of his sister, another who spoke broken English and asked about his family, a group singing Christmas carols in July that made him think about church back home. By his final entries before transfer, Thomas questions the justice of keeping these women in prison months after hostilities ended, noting that most seem to have been ordinary workers caught up in circumstances beyond their control. His diary captures a transformation repeated in countless Allied personnel who entered occupation duty with righteous certainty and left with uncomfortable questions. The administrative records and personal accounts from this period reveal systematic failures in how military and political structures address the complexities of gender in war and occupation. International law had not developed adequate frameworks for women who served in military capacities outside direct combat. The Geneva Conventions protected uniformed combatants but left ambiguous the status of auxiliary personnel. Occupying powers had to improvise policies that balanced security concerns, resource limitations, and cultural assumptions about appropriate treatment of women. The result was inconsistency and injustice, with individual women's fates determined more by accident of capture location than by any coherent legal or moral framework. This failure haunted some officials who recognized the inadequacy of existing systems but lacked authority or imagination to create better alternatives. In the Western zones, most women auxiliaries had been released by early 1946, returning to civilian life in occupied Germany. Thus, British closed their last women's POW camps in March 1946, processing final releases through demobilization centers that provided minimal documentation and no assistance for reintegration. The experience of captivity for these women lasted anywhere from weeks to nearly a year, depending entirely on variables beyond their control. Those who survived internment generally preferred not to discuss it, folding the experience into the larger trauma of war and defeat that Germans collectively suppressed in favor of rebuilding. Only in memoirs written decades later did some former prisoners describe the fear, hunger, and moral confusion of those months behind barbed wire, acknowledging both the hardships they endured and the crimes their service had enabled. The Soviet treatment of women POWs presents a darker chapter. Soviet forces captured tens of thousands of German women auxiliaries in the Eastern Territories and Berlin during the final offensives. Treatment was brutal from the outset, reflecting Soviet fury at German atrocities in occupied Soviet territories and Stalin's policies toward prisoners. Many women were assaulted during capture, then force-marched eastward alongside male prisoners. Thousands died during transport from exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition. Survivors entered the Gulag system, dispersed to labor camps across the Soviet Union, where they worked in mines, construction, and factories under conditions that killed thousands more. Soviet authorities made no distinction between women and men in work assignments or conditions, an equality that proved deadly for those physically unable to meet brutal labor quotas. Some women remained in Soviet captivity until the mid-1950s, released only after diplomatic negotiations between West Germany and the Soviet Union. They returned home years after the war's end, strangers in a society that had moved on without them. Western historical memory of World War II largely erased these women prisoners from the narrative. Post-war accounts focused on concentration camp liberation, Nazi atrocities, and the triumph of Allied forces. German suffering received limited attention in Allied countries, considered either irrelevant or morally problematic given German responsibility for the war. The specific experience of women POWs fit uncomfortably into established frameworks. They were neither innocent civilian victims nor clear perpetrators of crimes. They occupied a gray zone of complicity and suffering that resisted simple moral categorization. Feminist historians in later decades examined their experiences as part of broader studies of women's roles in Nazi Germany. But this scholarship remained largely academic, rarely penetrating popular consciousness. The confrontations over dignity, the organized resistance to violations, and the complex moral questions these women's experiences raised remained largely unknown outside specialist literature. The incident that gives this story its title, the refusal to undress at Lübeck and similar camps, represents something more than a historical footnote. It demonstrates how people retain agency, even in extreme powerlessness, through collective action and moral assertion. The women who stood together and said no to forced searching possessed no weapons, no legal protections, no realistic means of resistance, except their unity and willingness to endure consequences. Their refusal compelled Allied authorities to choose between using force against unarmed women or acknowledging prisoners' claims to dignity. That some commanders chose acknowledgement over coercion suggests that even in structures designed to dehumanize and control, individual conscience and cultural shame can create space for mercy. This dynamic offers no comfortable lessons. It does not absolve the German women of their service to a criminal regime, nor does it excuse the inadequacies of Allied policies. It simply reveals the messy humanity that persists even in situations structured by profound injustice. Understanding this history requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. German women auxiliaries served a regime that committed unprecedented crimes, and their service enabled those crimes even when they did not directly participate in atrocities. The Allied victory over Nazi Germany represented a necessary triumph of justice over evil. Yet the treatment of women POWs in the immediate post-war period reflected moral failures and policy inadequacies that caused unnecessary suffering. Individual guards and commanders made choices ranging from cruelty to compassion, revealing the variability of human character under stress. The women prisoners themselves displayed courage, resilience, and collective solidarity while also confronting their complicity in horrific crimes. No single moral framework captures this complexity completely. The history resists reduction to simple narratives of victimization or deserved punishment. The post-war lives of former women POWs varied as widely as their captivity experiences. Some successfully rebuilt lives, marrying, raising families, and integrating into West German society without discussing their past. Others struggled with trauma, poverty, and social isolation, unable to escape the psychological weight of what they had lived through. A few became active in peace movements or organizations promoting international understanding, transforming their experiences into commitments to prevent future wars. Most simply carried their memories silently, recognizing that German society in the 1950s and 60s had no space for nuanced discussion of their particular form of suffering. The social compact of post-war Germany involved collective amnesia about individual roles in the Nazi period, broken only gradually through generational conflict in the 1960s and 70s. When former women auxiliaries did speak publicly in later decades, their accounts revealed lasting impacts of their captivity experiences. Many described the shock of transition from military order to the chaos of POW camps, the loss of identity that came with becoming anonymous prisoners rather than skilled professionals. They remembered cold, hunger, and fear, but also moments of human connection with guards or fellow prisoners that transcended enmity. They struggled to explain how they had believed in their service without excusing the regime they had served. Some expressed anger at how they had been used by leaders who sent them to perform military functions while denying them recognition or protection when Germany collapsed. Others focused on gratitude for survival and determination to build lives oriented toward peace. These testimonies, preserved in oral history projects and memoirs, provide invaluable primary sources for understanding how individuals made meaning from experiences that defied easy interpretation. The legal and ethical questions raised by women POWs in World War II influenced later development of international humanitarian law. Subsequent Geneva Conventions addressed the status of auxiliary personnel more explicitly, and protocols regarding search and treatment of prisoners included greater attention to gender. These changes came too late to help the women who endured ambiguous status in 1945, but they reflected recognition that existing frameworks had proven inadequate. The evolution of laws of war demonstrates how historical failures, when examined honestly, can generate improved protections for future conflicts. Yet this progress remains incomplete. Contemporary conflicts continue to produce situations where gender complicates application of humanitarian law, and military forces still struggle with how to treat women captured in armed conflicts. The questions raised in 1945 persist in different forms 70 years later. The photographs that survived from women's POW camps provide powerful visual documentation of this history. Images show women in worn uniforms standing in formation, sitting on barrack steps, or staring at cameras with expressions impossible to decipher. The pictures reveal physical conditions, the muddy grounds and inadequate shelter, but they cannot capture psychological states or moral complexities. Some photos were taken by Allied personnel as documentation of POW processing. Others appear to have been made surreptitiously by prisoners or sympathetic guards. These images now reside in archives and museums, occasionally reproduced in historical publications. They prompt questions for viewers who encounter them. Who were these women? What did they know? What should they have known? How should we judge their service? How should we understand their suffering? The photographs resist providing comfortable answers, instead insisting on the difficult humanity of people who made choices in circumstances most of us cannot fully imagine. Academic historians have debated how to contextualize German women's participation in the Nazi war effort without either excusing complicity or denying victimization. Some scholars emphasize that women who volunteered for military auxiliaries made active choices supporting a criminal regime and should be held accountable for those decisions. Others argue that examining women's experiences of war and captivity provides important insights into how ordinary people become enmeshed in state violence, insights valuable for understanding contemporary conflicts. A third approach focuses on how gender-shaped experiences of war service and captivity, revealing how both Nazi and Allied forces deployed gender assumptions in ways that both empowered and constrained women. These interpretive frameworks are not mutually exclusive, and the most sophisticated analyses integrate multiple perspectives while acknowledging that no single interpretation captures the full complexity of historical reality. The contrast between expectations and reality defined the experience of German women POWs. They had expected defeat to bring punishment from vengeful victors. They had imagined starvation, forced labor, perhaps execution. What they encountered instead was bureaucratic confusion, overcrowded camps with inadequate resources, and Allied personnel who seemed uncertain how to categorize or treat them. This uncertainty created both danger and opportunity. It meant treatment varied wildly based on accidents of location and individual commander discretion. It also meant that collective resistance could sometimes compel better treatment than passive acceptance. The women who refused to undress for searches discovered that Allied forces had limits to what they would do to enforce compliance. Those limits existed not because of policy or law, but because individual soldiers and officers retained moral sensibilities that made forcing women to strip at gunpoint unacceptable, regardless of military necessity. This discovery did not make captivity comfortable or just, but it revealed that even in structures designed for domination, human conscience could not be entirely eliminated. As months passed and camps processed releases, women who had shared captivity departed to different fates. Some returned to intact families in areas of Germany that had suffered less destruction. Others discovered that homes no longer existed. Families had scattered or perished, and the communities they had known were gone. Women from territories now under Polish or Soviet control could not return home at all, becoming refugees in the Western zones alongside millions of other displaced Germans. The POW experience thus merged into the larger catastrophe of displacement that reshaped Central Europe in the 1940s. For these women, captivity represented just one stage in a trajectory of loss that continued long after barbed wire came down. Their personal histories intertwined with the massive population transfers and social reorganization that followed Germany's defeat. Individual stories absorbed into collective trauma. The question of what these women knew about Nazi crimes, and when they knew it, haunted post-war reckonings. Allied interrogators asked repeatedly what prisoners had witnessed or heard about concentration camps, mass killings, and systematic atrocities. Most women claimed limited knowledge, insisting they had performed technical or administrative duties without access to classified information about extermination programs. These claims frustrated interrogators who believed widespread knowledge of crimes must have existed among military personnel. Yet evidence suggests that Nazi security compartmentalization and propaganda successfully kept many ordinary Germans, including military auxiliaries, ignorant of the full scope of atrocities. Women who served in occupied territories likely witnessed brutality against civilians and might have heard rumors about worse crimes. Those who served in Germany proper had less direct exposure, though they certainly knew Jewish neighbors had disappeared and could not have been unaware that something terrible was happening. The degree of knowledge varied by individual, location, and role. What united most was a psychological defense mechanism that allowed them to not ask questions they suspected might have horrifying answers. When confronted with evidence of concentration camps during interrogation, many women prisoners experienced genuine shock. Films and photographs from liberated camps showed atrocities beyond what most had imagined possible. Some interrogators reported prisoners weeping and expressing disbelief. Others noted women who seemed to shut down emotionally, unable or unwilling to process what they were seeing. A few insisted the evidence was fabricated, Allied propaganda designed to justify harsh treatment of Germany. These varied reactions reflect the psychological difficulty of accepting that the nation and cause you served committed crimes of unprecedented horror. Accepting that truth meant accepting complicity, however indirect, in monstrous evil. It meant recognizing that the sacrifices and hardships you endured served an enterprise fundamentally corrupt and destructive. Not everyone could face this recognition, and some never did, carrying denial to their graves decades later. For women who did confront their complicity, the moral burden proved crushing. How do you live with having enabled genocide, even if your individual role was small and your knowledge incomplete? How do you reconcile having been a decent person in daily interactions while serving an indecent system? These questions haunted former Helferinnen who allowed themselves to ask them. Some found paths toward moral recovery through religious faith, accepting guilt and seeking redemption. Others focused on building constructive lives, raising children to value peace and reject prejudice, attempting to balance past wrongs with present good. A few became advocates for historical memory, speaking to younger generations about how ordinary people can be drawn into evil through combination of propaganda, social pressure, and moral cowardice. None of these responses eliminated the burden, but they represented ways of carrying it without succumbing to despair. The Allied personnel who administered POW camps and made daily decisions about prisoner treatment also faced moral challenges, though generally less acknowledged. Guards and administrators held power over vulnerable people who had served an evil regime. How should they exercise that power? With mercy that might seem to trivialize Nazi crimes? With harshness that violated their own values about human dignity? Individual soldiers and officers answered these questions through their conduct, creating daily realities of captivity through thousands of small choices. Some chose cruelty, using their power to humiliate and punish. Others chose basic decency, providing required care without gratuitous suffering. A few chose compassion, recognizing prisoners' humanity despite their service to a criminal cause. These choices reflected character, cultural background, and personal experience, revealing that moral behavior cannot be reduced to simple rules or political allegiances. The women who survived POW captivity and returned to civilian life carried memories and scars invisible to those around them. They had experienced total defeat, prolonged uncertainty, and moral reckoning that shattered comfortable illusions. They had seen both the worst and occasionally the best of human behavior under extreme stress. Most chose silence, recognizing that post-war German society wanted to move forward rather than examine uncomfortable pasts. But silence does not equal forgetting. The memories remained, surfacing in nightmares, in reactions to unexpected triggers, in the guarded way some women approached authority or enclosed spaces. Trauma shaped lives even when it remained unspoken, affecting relationships, parenting, and psychological well-being in ways that became clear only when researchers began studying intergenerational transmission of war trauma decades later. The historical record of German women POWs exists in fragments scattered across archives in multiple countries. British, American, and Soviet military records contain processing documents, interrogation reports, and administrative correspondence. German archives hold some personal papers and unit histories. Oral history collections preserve interviews with survivors conducted decades after events. Photographs provide visual documentation, yet massive gaps remain. Many records were destroyed during the chaos of Germany's collapse or lost in archive fires and floods in subsequent decades. Women who chose silence took their stories to graves. Soviet records remain partially inaccessible. What historians can reconstruct represents only a partial picture of experiences that affected hundreds of thousands of women. The incompleteness of the record itself tells a story about whose experiences get preserved and whose disappear from historical memory. When we ask what justice looks like for German women who served the Nazi regime and then suffered as prisoners, no simple answer emerges. They participated in a system responsible for immense crimes, though most had limited power and knowledge. They endured hardships and violations of dignity in captivity that caused suffering regardless of their prior choices. Acknowledging both these realities requires moral sophistication that resists reducing complex human experiences to comfortable narratives of pure victims or pure perpetrators. Justice perhaps lies not in determining whether their suffering was deserved or excessive, but in understanding how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil and how societies might prevent such complicity in future. It lies in recognizing that even enemies and those who have done wrong retain irreducible humanity that makes certain forms of treatment unconscionable. It lies in learning difficult lessons about war, power, and the fragility of moral judgment under pressure. The legacy of these women's experiences extends beyond their individual lives into broader questions about memory, justice, and reconciliation after mass violence. How should societies remember those who serve criminal regimes? What space exists for acknowledging suffering of people on the wrong side of history without excusing their choices? How do we honor victims of atrocity while recognizing the humanity of perpetrators and complicit bystanders? These questions have confronted every society emerging from mass violence, from post-Nazi Germany to post-genocide Rwanda. The answers remain contested and uncomfortable, resistant to the clean resolution we prefer in historical narratives. The story of German women POWs offers no resolution, only the messy truth of people trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that stripped away everything else, confronting moral failures while struggling to survive. In the end, the refusal to undress represents a powerful symbol precisely because it combined vulnerability and resistance, powerlessness and agency. Women who had lost everything, their nation, their cause, their freedom, and their certainty about the meaning of their service, insisted on retaining control over their bodies. They formed collective resistance when isolated individuals would have been helpless. They forced their captors to choose between violence and accommodation, and discovered that some captors retained enough decency to choose accommodation. This moment does not erase their service to Nazi Germany. It does not absolve them of moral responsibility for choices they made, but it reveals something essential about human dignity and resistance that transcends the particular circumstances of 1945 Germany. It demonstrates that even in extreme degradation, people can assert their humanity through refusal, and that power has limits when confronted with principled resistance rooted in collective solidarity. For the guards who witnessed this resistance and the commanders who had to respond, the moment created discomfort that prompted reflection. Forcing women to strip at gunpoint would require acknowledging that victory had transformed them into people capable of violations they had condemned when committed by enemies. It would mean recognizing that the moral clarity of fighting Nazi evil gave way to moral ambiguity when exercising power over defeated enemies. Some Allied personnel proved capable of this cruelty, as documented instances of abuse demonstrate, but others found they could not cross that line, that something in their character or culture prevented them from treating vulnerable women with the brutality war had normalized. These individual choices, multiplied across thousands of encounters, shaped the lived reality of captivity in ways that official policies could not fully determine. The historical significance of German women POWs extends beyond the numbers involved or the specific hardships endured. Their experience illuminates broader questions about gender, war, and moral responsibility that remain relevant decades later. It challenges assumptions about women as inherently peaceful or as victims rather than agents. It complicates narratives about World War II that depict clear moral divisions between good and evil sides. It reveals how legal and institutional frameworks designed by and for men proved inadequate when confronted with women in roles those frameworks had not anticipated. It demonstrates how power relationships shaped by gender operate even in military contexts, supposedly governed by impersonal rules. Understanding this history requires engaging with complexity and ambiguity rather than seeking comfortable lessons or simple judgments. The women who lived through POW captivity emerged changed in ways they struggled to articulate. They had experienced the collapse of everything that gave their lives structure and meaning. They had confronted evidence of crimes committed by the cause they served. They had endured hunger, cold, fear, and uncertainty about their fate. They had discovered resources of resilience they had not known they possessed. They had learned that solidarity with other women could provide strength when institutions offered none. They had seen both cruelty and mercy from those who held power over them. These experiences shaped the remainder of their lives, even when they never spoke of them, influencing how they understood themselves, their nation's history, and human nature. The silence they maintained did not indicate that captivity had not mattered, only that post-war society provided no language or space for processing such complex and morally fraught experiences. Now, more than 75 years after the events described here, few survivors remain to tell their stories directly. The women who refused to undress at Lübeck, who organized classes and choirs, behind barbed wire, who confronted evidence of crimes they had enabled, who rebuilt lives from ruins of defeat, most have passed from living memory into historical record. Their experiences survive in fragments of documentary evidence and occasional memoirs, available to historians willing to engage with uncomfortable ambiguity. What we make of their stories reflects our own moral frameworks and historical moment. We can use their experiences to explore difficult questions about complicity, resistance, suffering, and justice. We can allow their complexity to challenge our preference for simple narratives. We can recognize in their specific historical circumstances broader human patterns that recur across different conflicts and contexts. Or we can continue erasing their experiences from historical memory, focusing on clearer victims and perpetrators who fit comfortably into established narratives. The choice of how to remember reflects what we value in historical understanding. If we seek only reassurance that evil is easily identified and righteousness clear, then the story of German women POWs offers little. If we seek understanding of how ordinary people navigate extraordinary moral failures and what dignity means in conditions of powerlessness, then their experiences provide valuable insights. History serves not to make us comfortable, but to help us understand human behavior in all its complexity. The women who stood together and said they would not undress, who maintained that even in defeat and captivity they deserved basic respect, were not heroes. They had served an evil cause. But in that moment, they demonstrated something essential about human dignity that transcends the particular political and military circumstances of their situation. They revealed that people can retain agency even in powerlessness through collective action and moral insistence. That lesson remains relevant wherever people face systems designed to dominate and degrade them. The story concludes not with resolution, but with continuation. The women who survived captivity carried their experiences forward into decades of post-war life. Some found peace, others struggled with trauma and guilt. Most maintained silence while rebuilding in a society that preferred not to examine difficult pasts. Their children and grandchildren inherited legacies of service and captivity they often discovered only through researching family histories. The historical record preserves fragments of their experiences for scholars and others interested in understanding this period. The moral questions their lives raise remain open, resistant to final answers. We confront them still when we ask how to treat those who have served evil causes, how to balance justice and mercy, How to acknowledge suffering without excusing complicity. These questions have no permanent solutions, only provisional answers that each generation must work out in its own context. The German women who refused to undress in POW camps in 1945 could not have anticipated that their resistance would symbolize enduring questions about dignity, power, and humanity. But their choice in that moment speaks across decades, reminding us that even in the darkest circumstances, people can insist on being treated as human beings deserving of basic respect.